Today, I'm going to be talking about all things student loan debt, how to pay for your medical school education, and that's going to include talking through 5 common student loan mistakes to avoid, and of course, how to avoid them. So let's dive right in. And so, is this relevant to you? So, this conversation will definitely be relevant to you if you have to borrow for your med school education, or if you're thinking about it, or if you're trying to navigate what this is going to look like on the cost side of things and the repayment side of things, because that's also the other big conversation is, definitely how to fund medical school, but how are we going to pay this back on the back end? So I'd like to start with just talking about some common statistics or some averages of why this is such an important conversation. And I actually pulled this average maybe 3 years ago. So this shows a stack up of just the average debt amount for common graduate degrees, and medicine and health sciences is the highest. You are the most indebted profession out there. But what's even more interesting is I pulled this average for a presentation recently, and that average has gone up in the last 3 years quite a bit. Medical professionals are still at the top, so it is going to be common for a medical professional to be graduating with some significant student loan debt. And having a plan and knowing how to navigate that is going to be really important. And that also helps us just relax a little bit while we're in school instead of stressing about what this will look like post-graduation. We'll have an idea of how to tackle it, which I think can bring some peace of mind. So now, why is this, again, just kind of honing in on why is this an important conversation? Student loan debt definitely contributes to a lot of delayed financial decisions or life decisions. So I consistently run into folks who have delayed saving for their future because of their student loan debt, or moving out of their parents' house, or getting married even. So not only financial decisions are delayed, but life decisions are delayed. So it doesn't have to be that way. I think there's definitely some solutions for the repayment side of things that can work for anybody who's going to be borrowing for school. So we'll talk about those today. Now, my backstory. So at this point, I think I've advised on about 178, probably close to 180 million in school debt so far for over 1,000 clients. I am what's called a certified student loan professional, which just tells someone that I have the financial planning background along with the specific education and student loans. And I consult for a student loan planner. So that's a little bit about, my background, and it goes without saying, I'm a little nerdy and passionate about student loan planning. So let's kick it off with talking about the 2 different types of loans that you could be borrowing in the federal system for your education. Some of these terms might look familiar. So for a graduate or professional degree, you will be able to access either unsubsidized loans. So these are, you could have had these in undergrad as well, but this means that the interest on the loan when you borrow it starts accruing from when you borrow it. Some folks might have what's called subsidized loans from undergrad, which they're only available to undergrad students. And subsidized loans do not accrue interest while we're still in school. So that might be the case for some of you if you had to borrow for undergrad as well. But unsubsidized loans for graduate school, there is a cap on how much you can borrow. So we can only borrow up to $20,500, which usually is not going to cover the cost of attendance for most. So after that point, what we can do is spill over into what's called a graduate plus loan. And this could be kind of similar if you were ever familiar with a parent plus loan from undergrad. But a graduate plus loan, you can borrow up to the cost of attendance. So net the unsubsidized loan that we borrow. Unsubsidized loans typically carry lower interest rates. Graduate plus loans, there's a separate promissory note that you'll have to sign for this to have access to it. But you can borrow up to the cost of attendance, and the interest rate will be slightly higher. But those are really the only differences between the loans. They're, again, both federal. They'll have access to all the same repayment options post-graduation. So As far as the differences between them, it's more so on the front end, not necessarily on the repayment side of things. So you could also access what's called private student loans from a private company. I tend to recommend especially for medical students, we want to be looking at federal loans. And that's because private lending, the repayment options post-graduation are far less flexible. There's no forgiveness opportunities with private student loans, and they're just in general less generous. So a great example of this is we are still in a COVID period, and federal student loans actually were paused for folks who were in repayment. Interest was dropped down to 0% since March of 2020 because of COVID. Private lenders did not have to implement any kind of relief for their borrowers. So that's one example of just a current day way that the federal system can be a little more flexible. So what's good about going federal is you can always privatize the loans later, but we can't go private and convert them into federal loans. So that's important to remember. Now, a lot of the concepts we're going to talk about today are more so in regards to federal student loans, because private loans are like a traditional debt. There's nothing really interesting about them in the sense that we pay it back on the term that we committed to. Federal loans are very different. We have access to income-driven repayment plans. We have access to forgiveness opportunity. So they have to be treated a little bit different than a regular debt. Now, a good rule of thumb to know how to treat your student loan debt, and I think this is still relevant to you while you're in school to think about, is if our balance post-graduation is going to be much less than our annual income. And I know, residency period, don't really count that. That's the lowest your income is going to be. But once you're in practice, if your balance is going to be lower or about the same as your annual income, then mathematically, we should probably be treating it more like a debt. And that means paying it off sooner rather than later, reducing that interest cost over time. But if you're in a boat where our balance is going to be much more than our annual income, even when we're in attending, and probably will be going forward, then we might want to consider treating this student loan debt as a tax. And what I mean by that is we want to go in one of these two directions. We either want to be very aggressive with our loan situation, or we want to be very passive with our loan situation. And mathematically, if our balance is greater than our annual income, then this passive approach could make a lot of sense. That's where we go on an income-driven repayment plan, paying as little as possible to maximize how much we can get forgiven. And this is available to folks in public service and not in public service. So we'll talk about the different forgiveness opportunities here in a moment. Now, some of the concepts I'll be talking about today too, you can map out for your specific situation. On our website, we have a free calculator that you can download where you can plug in what your estimated balance will be post-graduation, what your residency income might look like, and attending income might look like. And you can start to look through these different repayment paths to help determine if an aggressive or a passive approach towards your loans could make sense. So this is definitely a resource that's free. Maybe take a look at it. I think it could be helpful to help determine which path you should be considering. And so let's talk a little bit about the passive approach, and that would be taking advantage of one of these income-driven repayment plans. So IDR stands for income-driven repayment. It kind of encompasses all of these different repayment options. So it's not a repayment plan, but it's one of the 4 different income-driven routes we could go. So the oldest income-driven plan on the block is called ICR, which stands for income contingent repayment. This is based on 20% of someone's discretionary income, and it has 25 years to where we make payments for 25 years. We hit our maximum repayment period. That's what they call it. And whatever balance is left over at the end of that 25-year period is then forgiven. But ICR is pretty expensive compared to these other options. Usually not something we're recommending for someone with med school loans. we're most often talking about these other repayment options, because remember, if we're going towards this passive approach on forgiveness, we want to pay as little as possible to maximize how much we can get forgiven. So income-based repayment came about in 2009. That's a little bit cheaper than ICR. It's 15%. That's a little bit better. And it's 25 years to the maximum repayment period. Then 2014, we got introduced to pay as you earn, which if you're borrowing right now and you don't have any loans prior to October 1st, 2007, you will have access to this repayment plan. So this is based on 10% of discretionary income and has a 20-year time frame to forgiveness. So, and I know these timeframes might sound like a long time, but if we're graduating with 6 figures of student loan debt, this might have been the trajectory anyways if you were planning on paying them off. So this could be worth entertaining to see, does forgiveness actually save us more money in the long run? So pay as you earn 10%, similar to REPAYE. Revised pay as you earn is based on 10% as well. That is really the only similarity between those repayment options. REPAYE has a 25-year time frame for folks in graduate school, and it always includes your spouse's income to the payment equation. So when they calculate these payments, if we're filing taxes joint with a spouse at any point in the future, and let's say they don't have student loans of their own, then our payment is going to be based off of that joint income, regardless of if we want it to be or not. Now, one way we can exclude spousal income from our payment equation is by considering filing separately. But REPAYE is a plan that doesn't care if we file separate or if we want to exclude that spousal income, it's always going to include it. So that's not a good option if we wanted that ability to exclude a spousal income. But pay as you earn, IBR, ICR, those 3 plans, you do have the option if filing separately. So that's oftentimes a conversation when it comes to student loan planning. It's not only the student loan plan we're talking about, it's also some tax planning too, potentially, to make sure that we're maximizing the plan as much as we can. So those are a little bit about the income-driven options. Now, so let's start to chat about a little bit the most common student loan mistakes and how to avoid them. I think that helps open the door to some more specifics on just how to treat student loan debt, some things that we want to avoid altogether, and just talking about these mistakes so you don't have to make them. So mistake number 1, this is a big one, but refinancing mistakes. So refinancing, what this means is we are taking either our federal student loans or our existing private loans, and we're taking them to a private company to reduce the interest rate, have potentially shorter terms for payoff. This is a great option potentially for someone who is in the bucket of their balance is going to be less than their annual income. So refinancing, why it's in this, biggest mistake column is we want to make sure we're not refinancing if forgiveness is something we should have been entertaining, because refinancing is a permanent decision. So like I said before, we can always take our federal loans to a private company by refinancing, but once we've done that, we cannot go back. So we always want to make sure that we know why we're refinancing. We feel very, very comfortable and confident in that decision, and we know what that's going to look like compared to staying in the Fed system and taking advantage of those federal flexibilities. So that's one mistake. This could also be on the flip side. If we should be refinancing, but we're hanging out in the Fed system for too long. So refinancing could be a really great option for someone who either falls in that category of probably needing to be a little more aggressive with their pay down strategy, or someone who just doesn't want to go that forgiveness path, that doesn't think that's attractive. So refinancing can be a really great way to reduce that interest cost over time, pay the loans off sooner rather than later. And right now, average refinancing interest rates that we're seeing are between about 3 and 5%. So usually pretty darn low compared to what our existing student loan interest rates might be in the Fed system. So again, just making sure that we know if we should be refinancing, doing it if we should, or avoiding it if we should not be. So number 2 mistake would be avoiding ownership because of fear of loans. And I see this quite a bit because this is a very overwhelming topic. This is not just a money conversation. I think that a lot of what goes into finance is behavioral. And so we've been taught that debt is bad. And there's a lot of shame associated with student loan debt. Sometimes there's a lot of anxiety or overwhelm of just not really knowing how to tackle it. You're going to school to take care of people's health, not their finances. So this is kind of a foreign subject. But avoiding ownership, we don't want to delay making positive decisions with our student loan situation. It can be overwhelming, but having a plan is going to bring you the most peace of mind. Not knowing what your plan of action is going to be is just going to create more question, doubt, anxiety. It's also going to cost us money or time, because if we're not doing what we should have been doing from the beginning, we've lost out on a lot of opportunity to save us time and money. So definitely don't fall into this category post-graduation. Now, number 3 is not having perfect information about forgiveness options. And there is a lot of misinformation online about forgiveness in general when it comes to student loans. So I think making sure that you have good information about forgiveness, that is a path, or just in general, student loans in general, and how you should be treating your situation is important. So some of the forgiveness opportunities out there associated with federal loans. So income-driven repayment, which we talked about just a moment ago. This is for anybody, as long as you're on one of those income-driven plans, making payments for either 20 or 25 years. Whatever balance is going to be left over will be forgiven. But there's also a program called Public Service Loan Forgiveness that is very relevant to folks in the medical profession, especially with a lot of residency programs qualifying for this. But PSLF, or Public Service Loan Forgiveness, this is a forgiveness program for folks who work in a public service setting. So at a nonprofit hospital, in academia, for the government, so the VA, for example. This is a great program. I think it's just very misunderstood. There are 5 requirements that we need to check the box for to successfully achieve that forgiveness. I was going to say, I knew I had a slide on that. So for PSLF, number 1 is, and this is again, forgiveness for someone working in a public service setting after making 120 qualifying payments. So 120 payments, if consecutive, would be 10 years. So that's a much shorter time frame than those 20 or 25-year timelines we were just talking about on income-driven. So with PSLF, there's 5 requirements we have to check the box for. First is the most obvious. We have to be working for a qualifying employer. So that's a 501c3, nonprofit, government entity. And this doesn't have to be a secret. You want to submit what's called an employment certification form post-graduation if you're working in one of these capacities. And that form tells the Fed system that you're pursuing PSLF, and it confirms if that employer qualifies or not. So very important form. It's the employment certification form. Helps, one, verify the employer. So it's not going to be a secret if it qualifies or not from the beginning. And it also counts up your payments qualifying for PSLF. So that's number 1. Number 2 is we have to be working full time. And many of you will be working way more than 40 hours a week. So this is usually very attainable for folks in the medical profession. So they determine full time as 30 hours on average or more, unless the employer has a different definition. Then you have to work that employer's definition of full time. And then that's also verified on the employment certification form I mentioned previously. Now, third requirement is we have to have direct loans. So private loans do not qualify for this program. Only federal student loans that you're borrowing now would qualify. If you're an older, or if you went to school previous to this experience, you have some older loans from before 2010, you might want to check to make sure you have direct loans. If you have what's called FFEL loans, or Family Federal Education Loans, which were issued before 2010, those do not qualify for PSLF, but they can. You just have to go through a process called consolidation to convert them into the right types. So not out of luck if you have the wrong types, you can fix it, but only direct loans qualify. Now, fourth is we must be on an income-driven repayment plan. So those four that we talked about earlier, income contingent repayment, IBR, pay-as-you-earn, or revised pay-as-you-earn, we would likely want to be on either pay-as-you-earn or REPAYE, because those are the cheapest repayment options. And if we're going towards forgiveness in any capacity, again, we want to pay as little as possible to maximize how much we can get forgiven. So very, very great, options to keep the payment proportionate to income. And that would be the fourth requirement. Now, fifth requirement is making 120 qualifying payments. So this is a payment made on time in full, where all four of these previous things I mentioned exist at the same time. So we cannot start this until post-graduation, but you can start it really as soon as you start residency. Best way to do that, because post-graduation, you'll have what's called a 6-month grace period where you're not required to make payments. And payments you do make during that time also will not qualify for PSLF. So if you're starting, a residency program June or July of the year or of the month post-graduation, it could be good to do what's called consolidate. Consolidate is different than refinancing. So these two words get used interchangeably quite a lot, but they mean different things. Consolidate means we combine the loans within the Fed system post-graduation, and that forgoes that 6-month grace period. And again, remember, if we're going on an income-driven plan, this payment is going to be based off of income. So don't feel like you're going to have to pay thousands of dollars when you start your first repayment journey, because that payment's going to be based off of either your current income and residency or the most recently filed tax return for you. The application links back usually to the most recently filed tax return, which the year before graduating, you probably didn't make much money. So that payment could literally be as low as $0 a month. And that's a great way to maximize starting PSLF as soon as possible and getting our payments to be as low as possible for that first year. So that's one way that you can maybe maximize getting PSLF going pretty quickly. Now, the forgiven balance on PSLF, or working towards PSLF, is tax-free. So what this means is the IRS considers forgiven or canceled debt as taxable to you as income in the year that it's forgiven. But PSLF is the exception to that. So we do not have to worry about paying taxes on the forgiven balance if we go this PSLF path. The income-driven path we do at this time. So that's oftentimes something we talk about. We talk about saving for that tax implication that we might have if we're going that longer-term path. If it's still going to be around, that's also something that could change. That tax implication could disappear. And it actually doesn't exist today. And what I mean by that is they recently, in the most recent stimulus package, eliminated that tax implication for forgiven student loan debt between now and December 2025. So that's not going to impact anybody on this call, but that could set a precedent for maybe changing things in the future. So definitely something interesting, not something to count on disappearing at this time for the longer term forgiveness, but something worth mentioning. So, but that's about PSLF and forgiveness in general again. Now, fourth mistake is using the wrong repayment plan. So we talked about a couple of the options so far, but some other federal options in the Fed system. Well, one of the plans we probably shouldn't be using if we're going towards forgiveness would be income-based repayment. That's based on 15% of your income when it could be based on 10 on REPAYE or PAYE. And we want to pay as little as possible to maximize how much we can get forgiven. Same story with ICR, very expensive compared to what we could be paying on those lower repayment options. There's also amortized options within the Fed system, where it takes your payment, spreads it out over a specific period of time, either 10 all the way out to 30 years, actually. So the extended repayment plan is 25 years. But if we're going to pay off the balance within 25 years, we might as well be considering maybe looking at that forgiveness opportunity, because it can be as short as 20 years or 10 if we're going towards PSLF. So same story with the standard plan. 30 years is the maximum repayment there. And if we're going to be paying it off for 30 years, we might as well maybe be looking at forgiveness potentially with that. So, and then the graduated repayment plans, these are actually the most mathematically inefficient plans in the Fed system, because what they do is they spread your payments out over a specific period of time, just like the other two, but it graduates your payments. So you start out with a really low payment that barely touches principal. So you're spinning your wheels on the payoff. And then every 2 years, that payment increases, which I think was meant to mimic income growth over time. But now we have the income-driven plans that actually does keep the payment proportionate to income. So this one's just generally not a good plan to be considering. Now, fifth mistake, using anything but one of these two repayment strategies. So you could probably guess what I'm going to say right now. We either need to be being super passive with our loan situation or super aggressive. So I think we can usually figure out which bucket we're going to be falling in, which helps give us an idea of what that's going to look like post-graduation. And really the efficiency of a student loan plan comes down to one of these two paths. So worst case scenario. So I know student loan debt is a horrible, horrible topic, but worst case scenario, your loans are going to be a tax. And what I mean by that is it can be 10% of your income for 10 years doing PSLF, or at worst, it can be 10% of your income for 20 years being on pay as you earn for the profession you chose. So again, if we're going that passive approach, we're not really thinking about it as debt anymore. We're thinking about it more as a tax on our income for maybe the profession we chose. And that's sometimes an easier way to stomach this conversation, because we want to think about it as debt, because it is. But with the Fed system, we have these options to leverage our money a little better, and we have access to these income-driven plans and forgiveness. So we have kind of the permission to to treat it a little differently than debt, and it can definitely be effective. So, or, if the passive approach is not the route for you, or you can refinance. So we can pay off this debt because tax isn't either attractive to you, or mathematically it just doesn't make sense to go the forgiveness path. So that's kind of the two worst case scenarios. It's either a tax on your income, or we pay it off in a relatively short amount of time. So just to kind of wrap things up, I'd say 5, quick tips I like to just throw out there and mention is definitely beware of paying your debt back when you shouldn't. So you want to make sure we have an idea, should we be treating this passively, or should we be treating this aggressively? Going the wrong route might just cost you more money than you need to spend. So 2 would be pursue your life goals and dreams. I am hoping you're going to med school because this is a life goal of yours. And the student loan situation, we don't want the student loans to dictate your career path. We want our career path to, we want that to be decided by us, and then the student loan plan can follow. So don't choose a career path or a specific specialty because of the student loans necessarily. Choose it for what you want to do, and then the student loan plan can, we can find a plan to work for whatever that choice is for you. Now, number 3, just a finance tip: limit spending, especially on houses and cars. It's really easy, especially once we get that attending income in the future, to grow into that standard of living quick, and you deserve it for sure. But definitely make sure we're being smart about our planning decisions in the future. There's definitely some good proactive things you can do to keep your income at or spending in a healthy parameter. Now, 4 would be avoid the wrong repayment plans. Don't want to be spending more than we have to. And then 5th, just to kind of wrap it up again, either pay as much as possible or as little as possible on our loans. So, and we're kind of wrapping up now for questions, but what we do, so Student Loan Planner, we do custom plans for when you graduate, if you wanted some expertise on that area and what you should be doing with your student loan situation. We also do pre-debt consults. If you wanted to take a look at, hey, I'm in this program, what is this going to look like when I graduate? We can certainly have that conversation as well. And if you had questions or really anything in general about student loans, you can email us at help@studentloanplanner.com, or our website is a very great resource. Our blog, free. We have topics of, we cover topics on anything student loan related, so you can certainly check that out. But I will pause and see if there are any questions we want to maybe take a look at. So what are some resources for us to refer to choose the correct repayment plans and loans? So first and foremost, post-graduation, you will have to do an exit counseling with your loan situation. That does help you kind of narrow down and look through the facts of student loans based on your situation. So that's the first resource. That'll be through studentaid.gov. And I also think that's a hugely positive and helpful resource as well for anything student loan related. So studentaid.gov would be really helpful. And then, as far as the student loan planning goes, working with the CSLP post-graduation or before we're borrowing the debt, that could be another resource to help choose the correct repayment plan. A CSLP or a certified student loan professional is specifically specialized in helping people navigate these repayment options. So that could be another resource as well, but great question. Will my previous years for PSLF count after I graduate from med school? So potentially, yes. PSLF is retroactive, meaning any qualifying payments we've made in the past will count. The key there is to make sure that you do not consolidate those loans from your prior education, because if you consolidate or combine those with your med school loans, we will erase that payment history. So you can still consolidate your med school loans by themselves post-graduation, but leave those other ones out. And those will, if you submit an employment certification form for those payments in the past, they can go get counted up. Now, doesn't change the fact that your overall timeline is still 120 payments from your newest loans, so those med school loans. So you'll get maybe a piece of your balance forgiven a little sooner than the med school loans, but you certainly can go get credit for those. All right. How common is it for medical schools to offer student aid that does not need to be paid back? So grants can be found. You definitely want to make sure you're completing FAFSA each year. Any grant opportunities would be found in that application process and then processing that. Medical school scholarships, those are available. Certainly something you can look into. It's school by school, so it's very school specific or potentially state specific. There's lots of scholarship opportunities out there you could entertain. Let's see, and then waivers. It just comes down to the school, unfortunately. There's not a really easy answer for that. But grants are automatically talked about on the federal level from the FAFSA application. All right. And I think I had this question already. What are some resources for us to refer to choose the correct repayment plans? So exit counseling is the first line of defense there. studentaid.gov, your servicer's job, so the company that collects your payments, they are supposed to have a good idea of the different repayment options and help you decide which one to apply for, but they do not serve as a planner. So they won't be talking through like strategy with you, but they can talk to you about the facts of the different options. And then a CSLP, or us here at Student Loan Planner, we can help choose the correct repayment plan and map out what that's going to look like over time. How common is it for schools to increase costs of attendance for students with families? Very common. The cost of attendance typically increases from year to year, anywhere between 3 and 8%. It's faster than inflation, unfortunately. So the sticker price of what college looks like right now for the cost is likely not what it's going to be by the end of the 4-year term. So that is something just to anticipate, that the cost of attendance will increase from year to year, unless there's what's called a tuition freeze. And they did do this during COVID, where they essentially froze the increase of tuition like they normally do every year to just what it was from the prior year. So it doesn't really make it less at all. It just kind of freezes that inflation. So, but yeah, unfortunately, very common. All right, we'll see if there's any other questions. Yeah, student loans definitely an overwhelming topic, but I think the more educated you are about your options, the more peace of mind you can have when it comes to just knowing how to tackle it and fit it into your overall financial plan. So, and physicians definitely have a unique repayment journey too, because they have, typically 3 to 4 years or more pretty low income until they start attending. So it's really great to have an idea of how to tackle it in residency, and then of course post residency too. So I hope this was helpful for a lot of folks to walk through just the facts and some planning concepts.
But I believe that was actually, sorry about that. I think there's one more question, and I think we have time for it. So I'm going to put it up.
As an incoming M1, how would you recommend choosing how much of your allocated loan amount to accept? This is a good question. So you can accept all the way up to the cost of attendance, but that cost of attendance is calculated based on not just tuition and the fees that go to the school, but also not standard of living, but like living expenses. They factor in food, they factor in insurance costs, transportation costs. So they factor in living expenses overall, which they might have budgeted that to be much higher than what you actually need. So I think that could be a nice budgeting exercise for yourself to see, did they overestimate on like how much I would personally need to be able to spend throughout the year or throughout that school funding period. And you could certainly accept a certain amount and then send the rest back. That's definitely an option. If you're going towards forgiveness, in a weird way, like if you're going to be going the PSLF route, or we know that taxable, like longer term forgiveness is going to be the path in a way, it doesn't really matter how much we borrow, because once we get past that threshold, the amount of payments we make over that time frame doesn't change, because the payment is based on income. It'll just impact potentially how much we get forgiven. So I also wouldn't stress too much about trying to shave that loan number down as much as possible if you're going towards forgiveness, because it may not even make much of a difference. And it might be better to just make sure that you have extra funds on hand for like an emergency, or if maybe you underestimated how much you would need for the year for that enrollment period, that can be safer than having to go maybe rely on a credit card or rely on a personal or a private loan to hold you over until the next funding period. So those are some thoughts on that too to keep in mind.
Awesome. We still have a few more minutes and people are still dropping questions in. So I'm going to keep putting some on the screen.
Okay, sure. All right. How likely is it that federal loans won't cover all of med school costs, especially as a non-traditional student who has worked for 10 years? The med school specific expenses like tuition, supplies like books, things like that, that is going to be covered. That is factored into the cost of attendance. What might not be enough is the living expenses that they calculate. So that's something to keep in mind if we are going to med school, and we have a family or we have other financial expenses. You want to make sure you're putting together a household budget to know, is how much I'm getting allocated for living expenses enough? And that can help, definitely make sure that we stay within a budget over that period of time of our schooling, and know how much maybe additional income we need to be bringing in, or if we need to seek out additional aid. Sometimes that can be a conversation with the student aid or the student, the financial aid office, on if the cost of attendance is not something that covers your specific living expenses. That can be a conversation you have with them. But generally, I would say it covers what you would need. You just might have to stay within maybe a tighter budget for living expenses than you did if you were actively working, for example. All right. So I live in a high cost of living area. I heard student loans can cover the cost of living expenses as well, but my concern is whether I can take out enough loans to truly cover a high cost of living in my area. So very similar conversation to the last question. That can be potentially discussed with financial aid. It's also something that you might have to make other sacrifices, living with a roommate, reducing the cost of living on your end. Or using like savings from prior employment. It can be tough for the high cost of living areas, but it should be factored into their cost of attendance. And if not, we can either communicate that with the financial aid office or find ways to be able to budget and stay within that specific parameter that they have plugged in for living expenses there.
Okay, we have time for one more question.
Cool. All right. For someone who recently finished undergrad, should I start IDR as soon as possible to get to 20 years forgiveness faster? Will the recent COVID changes and grace period affect this? Yes. So I definitely recommend, if we're going towards forgiveness, we want to start that clock as soon as we can. So ways that we could do that is forgoing that grace period. So that's the 6 months that you're automatically given that you don't have to make payments for during or right after graduation. You can forego that by consolidating and start repayment sooner, which could potentially give you up to 6 months, or 6 months, get you there 6 months sooner than maybe you would have if you used the grace period. COVID has changed things a little bit. So in a positive way, these months during COVID, the COVID forbearance that we have from March 2020 to September 30th, 2021, as long as we're on an income-driven plan, do count towards forgiveness. So we do not have to make a payment between now and September 30th, 2021 for this forgiveness or for time to start accumulating towards that forgiveness timeline. I think earlier we start on IDR, the better. And COVID can help just not have to, we won't have to make a payment. We'll get kind of free credit for forgiveness between now and then. So that could be helpful.
Well, thank you so much, Meagan, for coming here and sharing all this wonderful information. We had a lot of people join in and listen to you talk. So I hope everyone has found some information that they can use to help reduce their loans and debts and find the best path for them. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.